Wonderful. And believe me, we really need it. We don't have to invent anything new. Why don't we just pick up where the founders sort of steered us? Yeah. Individual liberty. That's what we want. That's what it's all about. Now, if you emphasize individual liberty, you solve all the problems. And one thing that we could have prevented our problems in this country. So if we got into this mess because we have not followed the Constitution, it doesn't take, a tremendous genius to figure out, well, maybe we can get back on our feet again by sending only people to Washington who have actually read the Constitution and you believe they will follow the Constitution. Woo! Instead, today we have a Congress that doesn't pay much attention. They don't probably even know, most of them, what Article 1, Section 8 is all about, and all the restraints. Our courts legislate, our executive branch legislate, and if they want a piece of legislation and the Congress acts too slowly, our president says, well, that's okay, I'll just write an executive order. But there's one thing very neat about a constitutional president. All the legislation that has been passed by executive order would be repealable by an executive order. So there would be no more assassinations of American citizens or a threat of assassination. Of course, if we get rid of all the unconstitutional attacks on our civil liberties, there will be no military coming in and arresting individuals in the individual states and put in secret prisons. There'll be no more of that. Once we get the list figured out, the list keeps growing, but very high up on that list will be the repeal of the Patriot Act. Of course, there is a lot a president can do, a constitutional president can do by issuing legal executive orders. The president is the commander-in-chief of the military forces. The president has the authority to bring the troops home without a congressional authority. Just bring them home.
Bring them home.
I'm not talking just about the Middle East. I'm talking about Germany and Japan and Korea and Africa.
Bravo!
And in the meantime, what they're trying to convince us of is that maybe we can back off a little bit on that, but now that we've declared war against the world with the global war on terrorism, they figure that from New Mexico or from Washington, D.C., they can have a drone war and kill anybody they want around the world. I think the drone war ought to cease.
Bravo!
And of course, there are many who think the drone war ought to be applied to American citizens. There is a plan now to have over 30,000 drones flying over this country. Of course, they have to be very busy. There's a lot of laws on the books, and there were 40,000 new ones put on in January, and they think the solution is, this compulsion is, we have to enforce all these laws. I have a better solution. Why don't we repeal those laws, plus more?
Yeah! Woo!
I imagine many of you heard the story just the last couple of days. There was a college student down in San Diego, college student there, and they said he was doing bad things. Who knows what he was doing, but he was in the state of California. If there was any disobedience to law, it used to be that the policeman had something to say about this. But who barged in? It was the DEA, arrested a bunch of young people for whatever suspicion they had. But what did they do? They put them in prison. Most of them got released, but they forgot about one. 5 days in prison, no water, nearly died, was in intensive care for 3 days. The DEA has no authority to be law enforcement in any state whatsoever. Especially if a state comes along and says that they should have a different position on drug usage and legalize and say that it is permissible. The last thing we should have is the federal government automatically and assuming that they can override any state law at all. They should be out of the business of invading this state to enforce law.
Yeah. Woo.
Of course, the real problem with the whole war on drugs, it does no good whatsoever. The war on drugs is a lot more dangerous than the drugs themselves. And if they truly were concerned about addiction, they'd have to be a lot more concerned about prescription drugs because that's where most of the addiction is. And if they cared about the practical effects of prohibition, why don't they go back and read history? Why don't they read what it was like in the 1920s and why the American people thought, well, this is foolish. This repeal is silliness about prohibition. Let the people decide what is best for themselves. That is what's supposed to be done.
Yeah.
But today we live, the way I see it, it is a period of lawlessness, and our government acts outside the law. Instead of the law protecting your privacy, they invade and destroy your privacy, like the Patriot Act undermines the Fourth Amendment. But do we have openness of government? No, we have secrecy of government. We pass laws that are supposed to protect whistleblowers, but if they do any whistleblowing and reveal some information that they want to be held secret, they get into trouble and they get thrown in jail and they lose their jobs. It should be the other way around. We want privacy for the people and openness of our government. Now, of course, one of the best examples of the need for openness is, the Federal Reserve System. We need to know exactly what they're doing.
Woo. And the Fed. And the Fed, 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 and the Fed.
Like I say, that's a very good idea. But, we can't end the Fed in one day, but the Fed will eventually end itself because it's embarked on a destruction of the currency. But in the meantime, why aren't we permitted to legalize constitutional money and allow people to use gold and silver as a currency? Bastiat had a good suggestion. If you or I can't do it to our neighbors, the government shouldn't be able to do it either. Yeah. So if you and I aren't allowed to counterfeit the money, why are we so complacent as a people to allow a secret group of people counterfeit the money and destroy the value of the money in the name of being Federal Reserve and regulating the economy? Yeah. They have a very, very poor record. In the 100 years, 99 years, it's only one more year, it'll be a celebration, or I won't call it a celebration, because the one thing we want to do on the 100th anniversary is to repeal the Federal Reserve Act, of course. But they have systematically destroyed 99% of the 1913 dollar. And the one thing that we have to be concerned about, the end stages of the destruction of currency usually goes very rapidly. It can slide for long periods of time. But then when the confidence is lost, it goes quickly, and that's when you get the runaway inflation. There have been hundreds of countries for thousands of years who have destroyed their currencies. And we're on the verge of it. The world still trusts us because once the dollar was as good as gold, and they have no other place to go because if they hold so many of our dollars, so it's in their interest to try to prop the dollar up. But the rate we're spending, $1.5 trillion a year that we don't pay for, and the Federal Reserve has to print the money, believe me, it won't last. The counterfeiting doesn't work. It's immoral for you to counterfeit and cheat. It's immoral, or should be immoral, for the government to be doing the same thing. But the Federal Reserve is an instrument for the growth of big government as well as an instrument for the undermining of liberty. The more government grows, the less liberties we have. And if politicians are rewarded by just voting largesse for all the special interests, of course they will. And up until now, that has generally been the case. But something significantly has happened here in the last 4 years ago. People are starting to realize, those who have to pay the bills and those who are on the receiving end know that this is coming to an end. And this is why these last 4 years have been very, very different from any other recession or depression, because right now we are the big debtor of the world. We are the biggest debtor ever in the history of the world, and the world is all in it together. There has never been a time in all of human history where the whole world was built on debt of a single paper currency. And so it's very, very fragile, and this is all what you're seeing in Europe right now. They're diving now down into another recession. At the same time, the big burden is debt. And what do the Paul Krugmans of the world say?
Teach him.
They say the problem is you're not spending enough money, and the government's not spending enough money, and the Federal Reserve's not printing enough money. But I think the American people have awakened, and they know that doesn't work, it isn't working, and that some changes have to come about. Now, we do know that the financial turmoil leads to political turmoil. If that happens, we could even lose more liberties. But you know what? I have been so encouraged in these last several years to realize that people like you have come out and you care about what's going on. You're studying, you're understanding about the Fed. You know something about Austrian economics. You care about personal liberties. And you want to end these senseless wars that are bankrupting our country too.
Peace.
In the last 10 years, $4 trillion was added to our debt just for the wars that we have been fighting. You know, after 9/11, of course, they passed the Patriot Act, and that was supposed to, I don't know how that was supposed to solve the problems by punishing the American people. By undermining your Fourth Amendment rights, how is that going to punish the people who did those deeds to us? At the same time, we went involved in wars. We didn't really go after bin Laden immediately. What we did was we went into a war that they wanted to fight for 10 years. We went into Iraq, and Iraq, of course, had nothing to do with 9/11. There was no Al-Qaeda there, no weapons of mass destruction. And so we go in there, and then, of course, this constant war in Afghanistan. But during this period of time, there's nearly 9,000 Americans have died. This counts the contract workers. There are 40-some thousand who have come back with severe injuries, hundreds of thousands who are now currently suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome, as well as brain injuries and amputations. It's a real, real tragedy of what's happening. So if we're going to pay back and penalize the people who did that harm to us on 9/11, how much more death and destruction do we have to put on ourselves for those happenings? It doesn't solve our problems. And killing a lot more civilians, invading more countries, all that does is stir up more hatred toward us. We have to understand.
Exactly.
We have to understand that it wasn't I who invented the term blowback. It was defined by our CIA, and it was well known in the Department of Defense as many other scholars that one of the main reasons why they wanted to come over here and do us harm, the main purpose and the main concern they had was occupation. And that is the reason I would say, yes, we should occupy the United States of America and not the rest of the world.
Bravo!
So the change in the foreign policy is obviously very vital, not only because it would make us safer, it would also save us a lot of money, and it is under the conditions of war that people are more willing to give up their liberties. So they say, well, you know, you've heard it, I'm sure. I've heard it too many times, that right after 9/11, well, yeah, I know, if they have the Patriot Act, we have to give up some of our freedoms. But don't we have to give up our freedoms to be safe?
No!
That is absolutely right. There is never a time when a free people should ever compromise and say that you have to sacrifice liberty for safety, because it's not true, and we never should concede that principle. we have conceded too much in the time of war, and just look at what's happening now. The president, by executive order, announced that he can kill American citizens. The Congress actually passed the law, the National Defense Authorization Act, which allows the military to arrest American citizens, put them in prison, no attorneys, secret prisons indefinitely. We can't allow this to stand. We as a people should not tolerate what we see on TV and the pictures of the groping and the X-ray and the abuse that we all go